Let's dive right in. Today we'll run through how to achieve this sticking effect that you often encounter with thin films. To do this, we'll use modifiers, touch on some considerations for more complex situations, and then break down some shading and lighting, mostly for transparent films. I've added timestamps for those who want to skip through. In a new scene in Blender, I've done a little setup. I have a ground plane and a target object. We'll add a thin film and attach it to this target. To make our film, we'll simply hit Shift-A, add in a simple plane, and I'm going to quickly rename it by hitting F2 and just calling this thin film. I'm then going to hit G, Z, and drag my film above the thing that I want it to stick to, in this case, the target. From here, I'm going to hit Tab and turn to Edit Mode, hit right-click, and choose Subdivide. Then I'm going to hit Shift-R a few times to add extra subdivisions. The more subdivisions we have, the smoother this approach, but don't go overkill because it will overtax your computer. Once I have a good number of subdivisions, I'll hit Tab again to come back to object mode, and for most of this effect, we're actually going to be using modifiers. So I'm going to come to the modifier properties, add a modifier, and choose shrink wrap. For the simplest case of sticking a plane to a flat surface, we're going to use the default version of the modifier as it's added. Very simply, all we're going to do is from target, we're going to choose our actual target object. From here, we're going to add a very tiny offset, 0.001 to start, just so that you can see they aren't overlapping. If we have an offset of 0, there's obviously some overlap between the thin film and the target, and we'd just like to have that not be the case for the time being. To control the area stuck on the surface, we're going to use vertex groups. The idea being that we can assign a weight to each vert in our plane. Verts with a weight of 1 will see the most impact from our shrink wrap modifier, and verts with a weight of 0 will not be affected by the modifier at all. We could add a vertex group directly by selecting our object, coming to the object data properties, adding a new group, and then in edit mode, selecting the verts that we want to include in that group. In this case, we're going to use weight painting to achieve this effect, but make it a little bit smoother. So from here, I'll tab back into object mode, undo the creation of this vertex group, or simply remove it by hitting the minus sign here. Then I will select my thin film, hit Control Tab, hold it down, and choose weight paint. You can see right away this has changed a number of options, but if I simply click and drag on my plane, I've now created a pattern and a vertex group has been added. Areas with red have a weight of 1, and areas with blue have a weight of 0. You can also see there's some degree of fall off, indicating that this is smoother. This is why we wanted to have more verts, because it's going to make that effect a little bit smoother as we transition from red to blue. If I wanted to, I could at this point also add another vertex group and I could paint specifically on that one. This can be useful if you want to layer different modifiers, especially different shrink wrap modifiers. Coming back to our first vertex group, we can look at some of the main controls for weight painting. Those are, by hitting F, we can change the size of the brush that we're using. By hitting Shift and F, we can change the strength, which will make the brush effectively harder or softer. So softer will have smoother fall off. You may have to paint a few times to get to the final weight. And harder, or a stronger brush rather, will essentially paint red right away. The last toggle that is specifically worth mentioning is actually painting with the weight itself. So right now we are painting with a weight of 1, meaning we're painting towards red. If we change the weight to 0, we're painting towards blue. So effectively you can undo or do what you want to with the vertex groups. In this case, I'm simply going to bring the weight all the way up to 1, and I'm going to paint on an arbitrary pattern. I could also use different fall-offs for the brush or create my own custom one to change how it varies essentially from a weight of 1 to a weight of 0. Once we're done painting, we can go ahead, hit Control Tab, and come back to object mode. We're going to then return to our shrink wrap modifier, and under vertex group, we'll use group, or the first one that we created. And you can see that the shrink wrap modifier is now being applied only to the regions where we painted. So regions that were blue in our painting are essentially not being shrink wrapped at all, and regions that are red are being pulled to the surface minus the offset that we created. We can adjust the entire height of the film at this point by grabbing it in object mode, hitting G, Z, and simply dragging down, or in whichever direction you're projecting. So in this case, I'm bringing the whole thing down, and essentially it's just grading or scaling the application of the shrink wrap accordingly. If I wanted to, I could also bring this value down a little bit lower, so I could lower the object, and then I could use the offset value to create effectively a bubble in the surface. By applying a subsurface modifier after this, so modifier, subdivision surface, and 1 or 2, you can now smooth this whole effect out. If you don't want edges to be rounded by your subsurf modifier, which you can see right here, right there, then you can fix this by simply tabbing into edit mode, hitting 2 for edge select, grabbing one of these edges, hitting Shift G, choosing amount of faces around an edge, hitting N to open the side panel, and bringing the mean crease value all the way up to 1. Now we have nice smooth areas here, but we have crisp edges. And in this case, I'm actually going to bring the offset down back to about 0.001, and I'll grab my plane and bring it up again so you can see this is the area that I have where it would be more stuck to the surface. For simpler films at this point, we could also add a solidify modifier, especially if your film is very thin. In this case, what we're going to do is just bring the thickness down until it looks like our plane is actually sitting on top of our target. So we don't want to go too far, but just enough. Something like this would be fine. You'll note that if we come into a wireframe, you can see it's actually intersecting underneath, but because we won't be able to see that, that's not an issue. So we now have a nice flat film that looks like it is depressed in a specific region on top of this target. And of course, if we wanted to, we could also modify this at any time by hitting Control Tab, coming back to weight paint, and changing the way that we've painted on this surface. If we come back now to object mode, you can see we've changed where this area is stuck down. From here, I want to discuss a few more complex scenarios, and then we'll get into some of the shading that is specific to things such as glass. For the first complex scenario, I've set up a non-flat target. You can see it's simply a distorted plane. I've added a good amount of subdivision, and I've smoothed it out. If we were to try our original approach of hitting Shift A, adding in a new plane, naming it thin film, and then bringing it above our plane, so G, Z, and dragging up, once again, I'm going to tab into edit mode, right click, and subdivide a good number of times. Once more, I think, if we go ahead and add our modifier for the shrink wrap using the default settings and then choose our target, you can see this has created an enormous mess. Now, the problem here is that it's actually using a wrap method of nearest surface point. And to get it to work on a distorted target, what we're going to need to do is change to project. In this case, we'll choose to project along the z-axis, and we're going to choose to project in the negative direction because our plane is above the target. Once we do that, you can see it's now snapped nicely to the surface. Again, I'm going to add a slight offset, 0.001, and you can see it's sitting above. In this case, because of the distortion, I may actually want to increase the offset. So let's go ahead with 0.0025. And now you can see it no longer looks like it's intersecting. Right click, shade smooth, and once again, if I wanted to, I could control where this is actually going to appear by weight painting. So I'll hit Control Tab, come to weight paint, and I'm just going to draw a very simple pattern with a bit of a softer brush. So I'll bring the weight down to 0.75, and I'll arbitrarily paint something over here, and right in the center. Let's make sure we have one area at least that is at least a little bit red. So something like this will bring that weight value up a little bit. And we actually do have to bring the final weight up or we won't be able to do it. So there we go. Control Tab, back into object mode, and this time we'll apply the vertex group. Now, if we tried to use our original approach of simply hitting G, Z, and dragging down, you'd see that the rest of the plane is actually flat and it's going to intersect with our distorted base. We'd like the whole thing to contour, but we just want one area to look like it's stuck a little bit more. The way that we're going to achieve this is we're going to right click to undo that. We're going to select our shrink wrap modifier, hit Shift D to duplicate it, and now this time we're going to come all the way down to the bottom here, our second shrink wrap, and under the vertex group there's this little arrow, and this is actually going to invert the selection. So rather than having this area be affected, in this specific shrink wrap, we're going to change it so that all the non-selected areas are affected. Because you can see that this is sort of acting in opposition right now, the way that we're going to smooth this out is again by hitting G in object mode, dragging the whole thing down until we're happy with it, something like this, and then we're actually going to use the two different offset values to control which areas are more or less stuck. So for the second shrink wrap, I'd like all of these areas to still be a little bit higher, but I want them to meet this contour. So I'm going to drag this value up until it's something, let's say 0.14. Now you can see it is hovering above this surface, but this area in here is actually lower compared to everything else. And that was the effect that we were going for. So when we finally set everything up, this area will look as though it is more depressed compared to everything else, but the whole thing will meet the final shape. Adding thickness to this can be quite frustrating, and honestly, the most straightforward way that I've encountered is simply get everything set up the way that you want, hit Shift D to duplicate it, right click to drop it in place. Now we have a second film, and we're just going to apply these two modifiers in order. So we'll apply the first one, then the second one. We could add another subdivision surface if we wanted to, but in this case, we have a final contoured mesh. So whereas the first one will update wherever we move it on the film, the second one is actually stuck in place over this area. We would simply tab into edit mode, hit E, Z, and extrude down until it touches the surface just about here. And this would give us a film that has some thickness, but is depressed in the specific regions that we originally painted out. For flat surfaces, or if you want something to have a flat bottom, make sure that you have just all of the bottom verts selected. Then you can hit S, Z, and 0, so that will give you a flat surface with a nice contour. You can see that here. But for the curved surfaces, you just want to take the original curvature and extrude everything straight down in the Z direction. In the second complex case, I want to discuss using a hidden target object. Once again, I have a distorted target plane, but this time I've added a cutout using a Boolean. I can show that or hide it at any time by simply toggling it in the viewport. What I'd like to do is create a thin film and patch it over this, almost like a band-aid. So I'm going to simply go ahead, hit Shift-A, add a plane, G and Z to drag it up, tab into edit mode, right-click, subdivide, and Shift-R a few times, same as we've been doing this entire time. From here, I'll tab back into object mode. Once again, I'll rename this thin film, and then I'm going to add a shrink wrap modifier. Because this is still distorted, if we use the nearest surface point, we're going to get the same effect, quite a mess. But this time, when we go to use project instead, Z, the negative axes, we see we're running into a problem with the Boolean. I'm going to start by adding an offset just to bring that up, but to fix the Boolean problem, we're actually going to have to change our target. If we grab our cutout target plane, and hide it, you can see that solves our problem. The issue is we would actually like that cutout to appear because it's part of our graphic. So the way we're going to solve that is we're going to use a sacrificial target for our shrink wrap. And very simply, I'm going to grab our cutout target plane, hit Shift-D to duplicate that, right-click to drop it in place, and remove the Boolean. I'm then going to rename this cutout target plane, but I'm actually going to call this the sacrificial version. And the reason that we're calling this the sacrificial version, which is a very long name, is because we're going to open up this little funnel, enable the render, the viewport, and the selectable, and we're actually just going to disable this in both the render and the viewport. Now you can see we only see our target plane with the cutout, and when we choose our thin film, we're going to actually target the sacrificial version. That means that we'll still be able to see the cutout, we'll still be able to see our band-aid effect, and if we put a transparent shader, it would be able to see through it. But we're not actually going to have to worry about any of the strange effects that we would get from layering on top of the Boolean. This is also very useful if you have a very, very complex model. So in the past, I've done this with all kinds of things, particularly for medical applications where you want to go on part of a bone or part of a surface of something, and you just want to actually grab your target, tab into edit mode, select just the area that you want. So we'll do that right now, which is just this area right here. I'm going to select these faces. I would duplicate those, right-click to drop those in place, hit P and choose separate by selection. What that's effectively done is it's now actually given me a smaller target. So if you're working with a very big complex mesh and you only need to shrink wrap to a small area, don't target the whole thing and don't make a duplicate of the whole thing. For our simple plane, it's not that big, but if your geometry is enormous, then you only want to target to the area you need, and that can really help you with your computer if it's not an absolute workhorse. Finally, we're going to discuss shading, and very specifically, we're going to talk about some setup for working with transparent materials. Most of what I want to discuss in terms of shading and lighting relates to transparent films rendered with cycles. To get the most obvious sticky look with a transparent material, you want it to be a little bit extra transmissive where it is most stuck. To be able to show this effect, you need good, preferably very bright lighting. I like to use HDRIs for this, and it often helps if the film is sitting on top of something that has obvious features that you'll be able to see through it. In this case, we're going to come to rendered view. I'm going to go to the little world properties tab here, add in an environment texture, and simply choose an HDRI from hdrihaven. I like the auto shop because it tends to be quite bright. You'll also want to make sure you come to render properties and enable film transparent. For the underlying target, I'm simply going to add in a material that I've already created, which is using a free metal texture. This is far too shiny, but for our purposes, this is going to be fine. And again, I want something that has this obvious distortion so that when I make this transmissive, I'll be able to see through it. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't a way to cleanly extract the weight information from a vertex group to use for shading. That means we can't easily assign different materials using the group, or groups. Instead, we're going to set up a simple procedural material for our thin film. That's going to allow us to control the appearance based on the position, or the height rather, of each point in the actual film. We can do this to make either a color or black and white map, and the latter we can use for all kinds of different settings for our shaders. To do this, we're going to simply open a new tab, come to the shader editor, and we're going to create a default or simple material. In this case, we'll delete this one, grab our thin film, hit new, and this is what we have, a material output and a principled BSDF. Very quickly, I'm going to jump to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and make sure that I have Node Wrangler enabled. From there, I'm going to click on our principled BSDF, hit Ctrl-T, and that's going to add in these 3 nodes for us. We're also going to make sure in our viewport that we are in either a material preview or a rendered view, because we need to be able to see what's going on with our shader. I'm going to start by changing the texture coordinate from UV to object, and then we're going to select this image texture, hit Shift-S to replace it, and we're going to change to a gradient texture. I'm going to drag a box over all these, move them to the side, hit Shift-A, come to Converter, Color Ramp, and add this in right between the gradient and the principled BSDF. With Node Wrangler enabled, I'll select the color ramp, hit Control Shift and left click, and you can see I'm now seeing the output of this color ramp node being portrayed. Right now, our gradient is moving from left to right, but what I want is for it to move from the top to the bottom. To do that, I'm going to move over to this mapping node, take the Y angle for rotation, add in 90 degrees, and then I'll bring up the X value until I start to see white appear. I'd like the highest areas to be white and the lowest areas to be black. You can see moving around our object, and we'll actually come to material preview so it's a bit smoother. This is essentially what we're seeing. We can use the color ramp for finer control. Right now, if I wanted to, I could duplicate this color ramp by grabbing it, hitting Shift-D, bringing it up, plugging the color in here, and then I could put this directly into the color for our principled BSDF, making sure to connect this to the surface. I could then add in specific colors if I wanted to, so I could have a gradient moving from something like blue all the way up to something like red, and using different aspects of the color ramp, such as ease, or by moving this toggle further or closer, I can control the fall off. And this is already a very nice effect if that's what you're after. The key thing about having a black and white map is that you can use it to control all kinds of other toggles, such as how metallic different areas of the film look, or how rough they are, namely how shiny or reflective they are compared to other areas. You can also control aspects such as transmission, which will only work if you don't have metallic selected and is better viewed in cycles. And you can also control the alpha value, which is essentially how transparent it is to the camera. So this nodes here actually gives you quite a bit of control, but color is a lot of fun to play with as well. You can also use this as a factor in all kinds of things, such as mixing shaders for different materials. Because we're using the vertical position of the object to determine the shading, we want to make sure that the edges and the bottoms have separate materials, especially if we're going to be working with something where we actually want to only see that difference on the surface. You'll recall that I said before, for complex objects, the easiest thing to do is line up the film the way you want, and then simply duplicate it, come back and apply the modifiers. So we're going to apply the 2 shrink wrap modifiers. Now with our duplicate object, which we'll just rename as thin film, applied modifiers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tab into edit mode, come to an orthographic view, change to wireframe, hit E, and just drag down until I have the thickness that I'm looking for. Something like this where it's actually intersecting the plane. If I come back to a rendered view now, what you'll see is that I'm still seeing that effect on the sides. So we'll do this a little bit more directly with color. And you can see the sides are actually pink where I would actually want them to be blue, because I'd like my blue to be the entire base and all of the lower areas, I'd like my pink to be the higher areas. To solve this problem, what you have to do is grab your selected thin film, tab into edit mode, make sure that you're selecting all of the bottom faces, which you can see are selected right now by default because I extruded them down. And then I'm actually going to hit Control+ once, just so I can get all of these edges, 3 for face select, and I'm going to add in a new material and assign this material. So we'll go ahead, new, assign. I'd like this to be the original blue, so I'm going to simply come up here, choose this little toggle here, hit Control+C to copy the color, bring it over here, and paste it there. I would then want to make sure the roughness and all the other settings are the same, but finally if I come back into rendered view, you can now see I have this nice gradient applying across here, but only in those areas. On the sides and on the bottom, if we just hit slash, you can see everything's blue, and it's only on the top where we see this gradient. This is a little bit more important when you're working with transmission because you don't want to use subtle tricks such as the alpha value, otherwise lower areas are going to disappear entirely, whereas you only want the sticky area to actually be applied. Finally, let's look at all of this together with a transparent thin film that is stuck to a substrate in specific areas. In this case, I'm going to take our existing shader setup, and I'm going to modify the color ramp so that instead of going from black or 0 to 1, white, I'm instead going to change the black value so it is a very, very light gray. And essentially what that's going to let me do is use this value to control that more precisely. So instead of going from 0 to 1, it's going to go from 0.9 to 1. This is very useful, and I could plug this into any kind of other thing if I wanted to, such as roughness, metallic, IOR, transmission, etc. But for this specific instance, I'm going to use the alpha value to make it so that the depressed regions are ever so slightly more transparent to the camera. And that can give the illusion that they are stuck down a little bit more. So if we bring this all the way down, you'll see many of these areas are actually changing to be completely transparent, whereas the thicker regions or the higher regions look more like glass. So this region looks more stuck, this area looks more stuck, this area looks more stuck. If I bring this value all the way up to white, you can see everything looks the same. And I can control this very, very subtle effect to make it look as though certain regions have been pressed down compared to others with this thin film. And with that, as always, thanks for coming out. This tutorial came as a request from a materials scientist trying to achieve this effect for their work with thin films. If you have an effect relating to your work that you'd like some help breaking down, throw it in the comments and I'll see if I can help dissecting it. If you enjoyed this tutorial or found it helpful, consider subscribing, sharing it with your friends and colleagues, or joining my wonderful patrons who support me in making these tutorials and assets freely available. Until next time, you have yourselves a great old day.